to get things moving. And so I know there's a lot of folks that have registered, and they'll just be joining us. Just so you know, I'll control through mutes, and if anyone has questions, use the chat option at the bottom of your screen, and I'll relay them to Shari, and we'll interrupt her occasionally as she presents. And it's without further ado, let me please welcome Major Shari Russell, the Territorial Indigenous Ministries consultant for the Canada Bermuda Territory, works in the cubicle right over here beside me. And it's been my pleasure to rub shoulders with Major Shari in her work and how it relates to family services. She's a wealth of expertise, knowledge, and just a blessing, I think, to our territory for the ministry she provides. It is I think, an area for us in family services that we need to be more sensitive to as folks come through our offices and into our communities. And so I just encourage you that today to be open, to be sensitive to what she will be sharing. She has lived experience, and I think that's part of the richness of what she'll bring for us today. And so without any further promotion, shameless or elsewise, I want to welcome Major Shari Russell to our session today. Shari, it's all you.
Ani Sigwa, thank you, Nuguch. Normally I would go through and do all these introductions, but I don't think we really have time, so I do apologize. It's going against my nature to just kind of dive into this stuff. But I thought it might be better to kind of share what I've got, and then if you guys have questions, if we have time at the end for that would be my preference. So I got to figure out again how to do the share screen thing. Here we go. Oh, I gotta go. Something happened. Let me go back. Here we go. Okay. I apologize, guys. I had this working. It's still doing the same page. Okay. We take that one out. Let's try this again. There we go. Can you see that now? Yep. Okay, good. So today I just want to do an overview, talk a little bit about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I'll come back to it at the end. Share a little bit about our story as Indigenous people, and then some steps, some practical things that you can do in this process. So those are three things I want to kind of cover. The TRC, or the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a lot of people have heard about it, but they've not heard about the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, which this actually developed from. So the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples started way back in 1996, and they had this Aboriginal Action Plan developed in 1997. And they made a whole bunch of recommendations which have been reiterated in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So I want to kind of shape that, because people think that the TRC calls to action are something new. And they're not new, they're just reiterated once again some of the same things that we're asking for as Indigenous peoples 20 years later. So when we think of that in those terms, for us, it can be a little frustrating to see the lack of progress. But I think Canadians need to realize that this is not a new conversation that we've had, and we're continuing to be diligent in that. So if you want to read the Gathering Strength Action Plan, you can look online. That's the website for it. I'd encourage you to look at it, and you'll see how many things are being reaffirmed in the calls to action. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, some of you will have heard, started September 19th in 2007, and it was a result of the Indian residential school settlement. So Canada's largest class action settlement was signed, and one of the stipulations, I guess, of that was that the Truth and Reconciliation be formed as a place where Indigenous people could share their story and where Canadians could come and hear their experience. So it was signed in 2007, and it started June 1st, 2008. Now, it did get off to a little bit of a rocky start, but it officially started June 1st, 2008. And its mandate was to inform Canadians about what happened in the residential schools. Take note of the date, June 1st, because 10 days later is when Prime Minister Harper delivered a formal apology in the House of Commons. And so it was actually after the TRC started, and many years after the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. June 10th, it held its first of 7 national events, and the Bentwood box was brought to each national event, and it currently resides in the Museum of Human Rights in Winnipeg. And then its final national event was held in Edmonton. Not a lot of Army presence was at these national events. Sadly, there were a few people that would attend. This last one, Jim Champ represented the Canadian Council of Churches and put a statement of reconciliation into the Bentwood box with the Salvation Army as a signatory on it. I was also at that event with Fred Waters, and so that kind of prompted a lot of learning for the organization, or for the leadership within the organization. And March 2014, it released its final horrific and damning report. If you actually want to read it, it's several documents long, like lots of books worth. But they put out that report, and it's good to read those stories. And there's a whole book, just one volume, on the stories of survivors. So it's good to read that. From that, the 94 calls to action came out in June 2015, which you might be familiar with. And I've just put here a couple of the titles or categories of things that we call for action from the government and from Canadians at large. The first and foremost one is regarding child welfare. And you may have heard about that. And it still continues to be a large problem because most of the kids in care are Indigenous and placed into non-Indigenous homes. Health and justice, youth, education, language and culture, museums and archives, which is an important part, and then media, business, and sports. And then there's a whole section just on reconciliation, and they call for the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which Canada has finally agreed to. It calls for a royal proclamation of reconciliation based on the royal proclamation, which was established many years ago. I can't remember the exact date, 17 something or other. And so they're asking for a new proclamation to be established for reconciliation. And they also asked for the National Council for Reconciliation to be established. And then there's the very last section I find interesting. The last call to action, number 94, has to do with newcomers to Canada and education for the newcomers, because some, in their experience of coming to Canada, don't realize that the land which you're coming to has been home to Indigenous peoples and continues to be home to Indigenous peoples. And so we want that recognized and a new understanding of our history for them as well as when they come to Canada. Some of the challenges, and we're just going to share a little bit of our story. I have a little video I want to show you. I can figure out how to do that here.
Video's not showing.
Yeah, I see that. I don't know how to.
We can put the video link on the page after.
Okay.
It's on, Shari.
Oh, it's on?
Yeah, it's on now.
Okay. Go back to the beginning.
No sound.
No sound? Has that done it?
There were complex systems of government, trade,
You might have to
agriculture,
listen to it
and
out here.
spirituality.
On both sides of the ocean.
On both sides of the ocean.
On the side that we refer to as Turtle Island, what is more commonly referred to as North America.
It is estimated that we were as many as 20 million indigenous peoples,
The Europeans knew nothing about us.
and we knew nothing about them.
Then Christopher Columbus got lost.
And so it began.
And in this new beginning, things weren't so bad. We learned from each other and traded goods that we both needed.
We taught Europeans how to survive in the New World.
We were guides.
We shared our foods.
Corn, squash, beans, potatoes. We shared our medicines
We shared the land beside peace and friendship treaties.
that were about, well, peace and friendship. We fought wars together as allies.
Some of us fought with the French,
Some of us fought with the British.
and after the British were victorious on the Dams of Abraham,
Things began to change. They wanted to segregate us from the thousands upon thousands of immigrants who were coming to the new colonies. So they started to push us from our traditional territories onto reserves.
In the West, we were left with little choice. The Hudson Bay Company killed all the buffalo.
We were starved onto the reserve. In Upper and Lower Canada, they wanted to sign more treaties.
Not treaties about peace and friendship, but treaties about land ownership and title. That forced us onto the reserve.
As time wore on, they kept coming back for more. More land for settlers. More land for mining. More land for forestry.
More land for it all.
And as time wore on, we continued to resist. So the colonizers switched tactics.
Instead of segregation, they tried to assimilate us into their society and culture.
They passed laws, such as this one, in 1857, an act to encourage the gradual civilization of Indian tribes.
Or this one, in 1869.
An act for a gradual enfranchisement of Indians. And then, in 1876, the most racist piece of legislation of them all, the Indian Act.
Duncan Campbell Scott, head of the Department of Indian Affairs, said it all.
I want to get rid of the Indian problem.
These laws had a tremendous impact on our people.
If an Aboriginal woman married a non-Aboriginal man, she lost her identity. If we went to universities, we lost our identities.
If we served in the armed forces, we lost our identity. We weren't allowed to perform our ceremonies, like the potlatch.
Which was our way of sharing our things equally. And then they did the unthinkable. They took away our children. They took away our children.
The residential school system was an attempted act of genocide against my people.
And still, we resisted.
We fought back. And we're still here.
Remember when I said they starved us onto reserves?
Today, they're trying to starve us off the reserves.
They're trying to make life in our communities unbearable.
In every measure, Aboriginal peoples fare much worse than other Canadians. We have a shorter life expectancy.
We have higher levels of poverty. 1 in 4 Aboriginal children live in poverty.
We have higher rates of suicide. We are 4 times more likely to contract tuberculosis.
Our diabetes rate is 3 times higher than the national average.
42% of our children lack basic dental care. 116 First Nations communities are currently under boil water advisories.
We represent only 2.7% of the adult population in Canada.
But 18% of the federal prison population.
Our high schools receive $2,000 less per student per year than provincially funded schools.
Nearly 600 Aboriginal women have been murdered or have gone missing in the last 15 years. These are the reasons we can't, we won't just get over it. I am an Indigenous person. I'm an Indigenous person, and I'm a union member.
And I'm a union member.
And we think it's time to take the next step forward in the relationship between Canada and Aboriginal peoples.
It's time for Canada to stop its attempts to assimilate us to the general population.
It's time to walk down the path of reconciliation.
Reconciliation.
Please join us. Join the Justice for Aboriginal people.
So it's a little video that's done for promotion of the union, but I think kind of gives an overview of the history and some of the policies that have impacted us and continue to impact us. So some of the key factors that you heard about in there that I just want to reiterate, kind of in the framework of what it means for us as Salisbury. One would be the Indian Act. And there's actually a new book that's just come out that talks about, I think, 21 things you didn't know about the Indian Act. And some of the impacts that it has on us as Indigenous people. So the Indian Act was established so that, and in there, it articulates that we are wards of the state. So they are to take care of us, to be our trustee, if you want to use that word. And so a lot of decision making, a lot of ownership, we weren't privy to in that. And so when it comes to the Indian Act, there are things that as Indigenous people, we are very we want to keep our identity, and you saw in the video that a lot of the policies that impact our people were to take away our identity and to assimilate us. And so one of the things that's important for Indigenous people is that we keep our identity, we keep our culture.
How are you doing?
A presentation. Oh, okay.
I'm on a webinar. I am like live streaming it. I have my.
Thank you. And so the Indian Act, can you guys hear me? I know somebody said it's low, but I'm up as far as I know. Can you hear me? Somebody nod. Yep, okay. So losing our identity is a big fear, I guess, for lots of Indigenous people. And so we react to that. And yet the Indian Act still governs a lot of what we do as Indigenous people and what our communities can and can't do. So that still is a big factor, especially for those coming from local communities. There's only so many resources that are given by the federal government for us, which you'll hear about in a minute. One of the key things about the Indian Act that impacted us was that if we wanted to go to university or further education, we would have to give up our status. And most people didn't want to give up our identity, and so they wouldn't go to university. Even as clergy, up until not too long ago, if I wanted to become clergy, I would have had to give up my status. So those things still have impacted us. The other part is reserves, and on the video it mentions there that originally the government put us on reserves to kind of keep us contained in an area, and now that land is isn't always sufficient to sustain our people, and so they're coming off the reserves. In the video it talks about being starved off the reserves, but there's not enough room, for example, for housing in some places, and so there's inadequate housing, and so they have to come off just to live, and then we lose a lot of connections with our community. The other I put on there is the culture of poverty, because sometimes the culture of poverty is confused with Indigenous culture. Now there are some similarities because a lot of our Indigenous people have experienced poverty, but the culture of poverty is very different, or can be seen as different than Indigenous culture, although they have kind of blended together throughout the years. And so one example of the culture of poverty would be the attention to the immediate. So they don't necessarily think down the road, tomorrow, but they just see what they need in the immediate. And so that's a culture of poverty that has kind of transferred over to Indigenous culture as well. But traditionally our culture wouldn't just think of the immediate. We would also plan for tomorrow. And so some of our elders are trying to reteach our traditional values and that impact for our community. The other factor there is some of the stereotypes. And I have another video on this, so I'm going to try this one. It's actually embedded in this, so hopefully it will work. If you've seen this one, I do apologize, but Wab Canoe does a great job in talking about some of the stereotypes. No sound?
On the side. But for this thing to work,
Okay.
hey Canada, I'm Wap Canoe. I know I'm not your boyfriend, but wouldn't mind being your man on the side. But for this thing to work, there's 5 things you're gonna have to stop saying about my people. First thing, alcohol. The big thing that separates us here isn't the alcohol, it's the poverty. Because when a non-native person passes out, they do it at a curling club or at a Nickelback concert. But when a native person does, they do it on the street, which is shameful, but also comfortable. Then there's this whole idea of get over it. You know, why don't you guys just get over it? You know what? I am over it. My dad was raped in a residential school by a nun. I'm over it. But it doesn't mean that we should forget it. Then there's the long hair thing. You know, some Aboriginal people do wear their hair long as a symbol of cultural pride. Those are the natives with beautiful, long, straight hair. For curly-haired Ojibwe such as myself, hair clippers have been the greatest invention of the white man since the mirror. Then, I often hear this question. What are you guys doing with the $7 billion? $7 billion we give Indian Affairs. What are you guys doing with it? You know what? That money has to pay for a population the same size as New Brunswick. You know what New Brunswick spends on their population? $8 billion. And yet I never hear Canadians ask, hey, New Brunswick, what are you doing with your $8 billion? Finally, one of your favorites, taxes. Guess what? I'm a status Indian. I pay income tax. I pay sales tax. I once even paid a land transfer tax. Ironic. It's all part of a much larger stereotype that Aboriginal people in Canada are getting a free ride. 140 years after the treaties, we're still waiting for the things that we were promised in those agreements to share the land. So I ask you, who's really getting the free ride?
So, if you haven't heard of Wab Canoe, he's a great guide to get to know. He does lots of neat things. But those are just some stereotypes that general population often has. So I think he addresses them in a good way. Some Indigenous values, and Peter just reminded me to speak up, which I could say one of our, and I could talk about some of our cultural differences. There are 2 that I can think of that might be impacting community and family services. One would be is that we generally, as Indigenous people, are much more soft-spoken, and we don't necessarily speak out loud, which I can talk about in terms of community. But the other is eye contact, and I really try hard to make eye contact, especially with those that I see in leadership or in authority. But I still struggle sometimes, even making eye contact. So I'm looking down at, actually it's Kathy in the bottom of my screen. It's a familiar, comfortable, safe kind of person I know. So that helps. But for people coming in to family services, they might not look at you in the eye, and they might not give a lot of responses right away because you're a person in authority and power. So some Indigenous values that impact us is our sense of community. As Indigenous people, the collective or the sense of community is much greater than the individual. So if you see somebody in your community rising above others, there might be some in the community that will try and keep them humble or on the same level. And so sometimes you'll see that if a person goes away to get their education and they come back into the community, you'll see a community response from an outsider might look like they're really discouraging them to do their education, but it's more a fact of the community value is much greater than the individual rising or succeeding according to Western standards. And so that sense of community can often be seen as a bit of a challenge within Western culture. The other would be our value of sharing. when we have something, we share. And so I can give an example of my sister who is quite traditional. Lived she lived on the reserve. She's passed away now, but she had the only community freezer or deep freeze in the community, and so everybody would bring meat if they went hunting. They would bring the meat and they put it all in her freezer, and then they would just come as they needed. And she didn't keep track of whose meat it was or anything. It's just people knew that that's where the meat was, and so they all went to her house just to get the meat. So whether she was home or not, they would just come if they needed to get them. So people outside would look, well, that's your deep freeze. You should put your meat in it. Um, they're just coming into your house, whether or not you're there, and they're taking it, even if it wasn't their meat that they got or that they hunted, because it was meat there. So there's all kinds of factors that would play into that. When we were in Winnipeg, we would do some family services work, and people would come to the food bank and they would get food, um, and it would go very quickly. And in conversation with people, it became apparent that what for them it wasn't just food for their immediate family, um, but for their extended family as well, because they needed food as well. So people would come, and so that concept of sharing sometimes kind of went and clashed with the Western standards that we had at that time. So those are, I just highlighted two Indigenous values that sometimes come in conflict with ours. Steps to empowerment. I want to talk about this. The first is get to know us as Indigenous people. And somebody once asked, actually, I just want to read this. Sharon Lisa Harper, who's a friend of ours, was speaking with my friend Richard, and she said, asked him the question, how can we even begin to engage again with the sin against First Nations of the Americas? And she said most people are too overwhelmed by it to even think about it, and we're too afraid that if we ask what it will take to make things right, and sometimes people are afraid that answer will be go back where you came from, and so people never ask what will it take to bring reconciliation about. What will it take to walk that journey of reconciliation? And so Richard answered, basically, get to know us. Just be our friend. Come and talk to us. Get to know us. Get to know what makes us laugh and what makes us cry. And when you find out what we care about, then make our concerns your concerns. Make our struggles for justice your struggles for justice. That's what repentance looks like, and that's what will repair what is broken between us. And so I always say, just get to know us. If you don't have Indigenous friends, um, I would encourage you to reach out of your comfort zone and begin to get to know people that are different than you. Whether, they might be Indigenous, they might be from another cultural background. But I always say, get to know people that are different from you. Expand your your friend base beyond that. The other thing I would say is learn about our story more fully. So I just played one little snippet of the video just to give you a little bit of introduction to our history. There's so much more. And the more that you read about it, the more you might shake your head. In The Salvationist this month in June, there's an article written by Doug Binner, who's been on this journey of learning. And he's talking about residential schools because although they're closed, some of them are still standing. So what do we do with that? Learn about what Indigenous people might say about that. Learn our story more fully. Learn about um, child welfare and some of the issues that are still going on to this day. If you've never heard of Cindy Blackstock, get to read about Cindy Blackstock and what she's doing as far as child welfare. Raven Sinclair, the 60 Scoop. I mean, it's in the news, or it has been recently, the 60 Scoop lawsuit that's gone on, a class action lawsuit. Learn about that. Why is that important? What are some of the struggles with that lawsuit um, that's gone on? Learn about the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Uh, Begin to understand the stories and some of the prejudice that impacts that. Learn about uh, Bill C-252, if you don't know what that is. Learn about the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And I'll talk a bit about that. So those are some of those things. You know, learn that story more fully. I could talk for hours about the things that we need to learn about. But part of it is we need to do our homework. We need to be actively learning about this, and so I encourage you in that. And if you have more questions as you go along, feel free to ask me. My friend, one time I mentioned about the 60 scoop, and she said, what is that? And I said, well, look it up. And so she looked it up on the internet, and it had all these links, these sublinks, and so, you know, it kind of led her to that page, and then it led her to this page, and then it led her to that page. And then she phoned me and she said, my goodness, I don't know what to do with all this information. She goes, how did I not know this? Number one. And how much more don't I know? And so she's kind of been on this journey of learning and beginning to understand the things that make us grieve as Indigenous people, things that make us um, passionate about. And so the other thing I would say is celebrate with us. National Indigenous Day is coming up on the 21st. If you're doing something in your local ministry unit, good for you to celebrate that. If you're not, maybe you want to join with the local community that's doing something. It might be going to a powwow. It might be sitting with elders and learning a little bit of the language. It might be having story time with elders. It might be um, participating in crafts. So there's lots of things that are going on. National Indigenous Day, I have a little under the Canadian Heritage site. You can look at some more stuff there, but I encourage ministry units to say, hey, this is a significant day for a part of our population that we've overlooked. So how can we continue to raise awareness? There are some other important dates. March 31st is National Aboriginal Languages Day. A lot of our languages we weren't allowed to speak, and so we've lost some, and they're being revitalized. And I would say, learn to say hello and thank you in the local languages that are around you. So I'm in Anishinaabe, so to say Nin Sigwa would be huge when I come into a family services building. If somebody said Anin Sigwa, I'm people might cry actually, because it's just saying hello. To say Miigwech, thank you at the end. Learning to say good morning in whatever language. So encourage you to do that. May 23rd to 27th is National Aboriginal Awareness Week, which happens to be this week. August 9th is the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples. And then September 30th is Orange Shirt Day, which is in memory of and to honor those that went to Indian residential schools. And if you don't know about Orange Shirt Day, you can Google it and it will give you some information on there. I know one ministry unit that had a thrift store actually. In their thrift store, they wanted to do something to raise awareness. And so they engaged with the local community to say, how can we help create awareness? And I'm not sure, I think they all wore orange shirts that day and handed out some pamphlets on that. So, and the last one is to engage with the TRC calls to action. Now I put on there 150 acts of reconciliation. You can Google that, 150 acts of reconciliation. It gives you all kinds of things that you can do to help begin that reconciliation process. And it might be as simple as starting to read Indigenous authors and not Joseph Boyden. So there's, yeah. But to read real Indigenous authors. And there are some and becoming more well known. Lexi Sherman is American. To listen to Indigenous music, to watch videos that are produced by Indigenous producers, because we do have them. But even movies that aren't, that are about Indigenous issues. For example, Indian Horse, which was just put out, wasn't done by an Indigenous producers, but it was based on the book by Richard Wagamese, who was Indigenous. And so I encourage you to do that. And there's all kinds of other ideas that has there. So I encourage you to do that. The calls to action, I do want to highlight this book. We did make a little book. If you don't have this in your ministry unit, it's $1.50. It's available online. Can you see it? It's under our SA Ministries resources. It's the Salvation Army in Canada and Indigenous Peoples, a Journey of Reconciliation. We do on the website under SA Ministries resources, we have a section for Indigenous Ministries, and it has a list of resources. It has some interviews. It has some books that we're putting out. This one is to give a basic understanding of what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was about and our response to it. So we responded to specifically call to action number 48, which asks for the churches to adopt and comply with the principles, norms, and standards of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. When you read the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, it's basically asking for basic human rights that in the 1940s was established in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, but it was not always applied to Indigenous peoples across the world. And so Indigenous peoples worldwide began to write a declaration asking for Indigenous rights or asking for human rights for Indigenous peoples. It took 30 years to get that approved and passed through the UN, but they finally did it. And, I got to speak with one of the original authors, who's a real gem. But in the calls to action, we said we would adopt and comply with the UN Declaration. So looking at the UN Declaration on Indigenous human rights, they articulate specific rights. Right to the enjoyment of human rights and equality, right to self-determination in Indigenous institutions, the right to culture, religious, and linguistic identity, the right to life, integrity, and security, the right to education, public information, and employment, the right to participate in decision-making and free, prior, and informed consent, economic and social rights, the rights to lands, territories, and resources, and then a section on policy assessment. So we developed a more comprehensive response to this, taking each one of those categories and saying, as a Salvation Army, these are ways in which we could engage these human rights of the UN Declaration. For example, economic and social rights. We said these rights speak to the economic and social well-being of Indigenous people. They are obstacles that still impede Indigenous people from fully utilizing the benefits of these rights. The Salvation Army seeks to uphold the principles of economic, social health, and viability through programming, through best practices, and through employment. And so we kind of flushed it out a little bit. And then we encourage every ministry unit to say, okay, in our area, these are areas that we want to focus on. Another one is the right to culture, religious, and linguistic identity. So the right to cultural identity permeates the UN Declaration, and cultural rights include the maintenance of their distinct institutions, the right to not be subject to forced assimilation or destruction of their culture, determination of membership in accordance with their traditions, practicing and revitalizing cultural traditions and customs, and redress with respect to their cultural, intellectual, religious, and spiritual property taken without their free, prior, and informed consent or in violation of their laws, traditions, and customs. Manifesting, practicing, developing, and teaching their spiritual and religious traditions, customs, and ceremonies, and maintaining their religious and cultural sites together with repatriation of their human remains, culturally appropriate education, and dignity and diversity of their cultures, histories, aspirations reflected in education and public information. And so as a Salvation Army, we said, we acknowledge the assimilationist colonial practices within our society and religious institutions which have continued to impact Indigenous people. We recognize our complicity in this and endeavor to reshape our relationship with Indigenous people, respecting their self-determination in cultural, religious, and linguistic practices. In order to uphold this, we will do through accessibility. So providing accessibility for Indigenous people to participate and maintain their cultural, religious, and linguistic identity. Engaging in collaborative and open dialogue with Indigenous individuals and organizations to facilitate accessibility is integral to them. And awareness and education, we said we do that through. And so teaching our clergy and teaching our employees, volunteers, and members about Indigenous cultures and traditions is a responsibility of the local unit. And then redress, cultural, intellectual, religious, and spiritual property inappropriately acquired will be returned, which is an important part. For example, in our thrift stores, making sure that if, for example, regalia comes in, that it gets returned to the local community, who will know what to do with that. And then relational values within our organization will continue to engage effective measures to combat prejudice, eliminate discrimination, promote tolerance, understanding, and good relations through our core values, our Salvation Army core values. So what you see how we've taken the UN Declaration on the rights, and then we said, okay, as a Salvation Army, these are ways that we can engage. And so it's a much more comprehensive document. If you want a copy of it, I can send it to you. We might post it online as well. So I want to leave time for questions. So that's all I'm going to say about that. That's a lot of stuff. More than I'm used to talking.
All right.
Is that
So,
Pete?
Yeah, I'm on. And so just, if there's any questions for Shari, now's the time. So on the left-hand side of your bottom screen, you'll see the mute, and you can unmute yourself, or you can use the chat button on the bottom, and I can echo your question to Shari. So is there any questions or anything you'd like further information about? One of the things that I can speak about is the document that Shari shared, this one here, and as I go there, the Salvation Army in Canada and Indigenous Peoples document that she said is available for $1.50. Highly recommend this. It's a fabulous primer to get you and your volunteers and your ministry unit working and thinking about these things. And the other one I'll just highlight is the Salvationists from last November. If you don't have a copy of that, we can send that to you, but it's a journey of reconciliation, and just highly recommend you starting to look at these websites that Shari has shared, and maybe your own journey on discovery. I've got a couple of chat questions. Let me see what we've got. So Shari, can you give us a few examples of places, ministry units that have engaged in ways that you've suggested?
Yep, I can actually. A few, which is good. Recently, Hamilton is wanting to do education for their staff and employees, and so they held a day where I came and did the blanket exercise, and then had a session specifically on faith and culture, and then we had some evening sessions. But part of it was, I said, I'm not doing this all alone. It's too easy for you guys just to have me come and do something. I want you to actually connect with local Indigenous people to come and speak specifically on issues that might be relevant within your communities. And so they had a speaker come that talked about some of the youth issues. And so they came from the Hamilton Indian Resource Center, and she brought a drummer that came and drummed some songs. Beautiful young gentleman came, very gracious, good singer, came and sang, and then she shared, and that was in the afternoon. And then in the evening, we had Chief Ava Hill come and speak specifically about some of the issues that they encounter on their reserve. And if you're familiar with Six Nations, it's one of the biggest reserves in all of Canada. And they have this beautiful water tower when you come into the reserve, but it only services 9% of their community. And so the rest of the community doesn't have fresh water that we would take for granted. And they're only 20-minute drive from Hamilton, which is a big urban center. And you're thinking, how could they not have fresh water? They're only 20 minutes down the road. And so some of those issues have become pertinent and relevant to that community. Within Hamilton, I'll pick on Hamilton because I think they're doing some good things. Ellen Osler Home has made connections with some of the Indigenous organizations, some of the Indigenous elders to come in and share with their residents there. It might be some teachings, it might be craft time, but they have them come in and bring some of their strengths and some of the culture that they have. So, Coburg. Coburg's another one. I went out there, and they're doing some great things with a nearby First Nations community. They had a whole cultural weekend. They had a drum group come in and share. We did the blanket exercise. I did the morning service with them. But establishing those connections with the community and making sure that they feel safe to come in. I mean, you don't just have a drum group come into a church, because the church for hundreds of years actually said that you couldn't drum in church. And there are lots of churches even to this day that think you can't drum in church. But I'm thinking there's lots of drums in church. They just look different. So they had a drum group come in with all these young people, and they did some dancing, and we got to share in a round dance together, and make crafts and bannock. So it was just a real community celebration gathering. I thought that was great. I could give more, but anybody else?
Well, I'm going to jump in. You mentioned a couple of things that I'm going to highlight. First and foremost, I hope everyone caught that Shari said she goes out and does these things with units. So please take note of that, that as a territorial consultant, she's available to come out and support you. But the other thing that I really want to highlight is that she encourages you to get out and make these connections in your community. She also slipped something else in there that I'm not sure that you folks caught, and I want her to come back to it, and that was a blanket exercise. And then I've got another question for you, Shari, but let's talk about the blanket exercise for a second, because that is very significant.
Has come out. It is a interactive teaching tool that walks through our history as Indigenous people, and some of the policies that impacted us. Is very powerful. Emotively, it challenges everybody. And so I've gone out as a facilitator to do this and do some teaching surrounding it. So it's a good way to engage people in the history rather than just listening to somebody lecture, because that's kind of boring. And it leaves you with the feelings of it. And yeah, I don't know what else to say about that. So. You're on mute, Peter.
I'm back. I'm just typing. There we go. I'm talking. Nobody can hear me. There, I'm back. Jenny Foster just wanted to say, Shari, thanks so much for sharing. I look forward to reading the Salvation Army Indigenous Peoples document.
Okay.
And then I was just replying, typing back, because the folks that are identified as the Salvation Army shared to everyone. And I just want to make sure everybody read this. I know that we have a local group, I believe it's called 7 Generations. And I've spoken to a member of the staff from there regarding some of our services. And I did ask if they would come and receive from our office. Her response was that the people she deals with feel very judged by non-Indigenous persons and will not come to our office. How would you suggest we as a Salvation Army reach out? And I think that's something very significant that you've shared. I just asked where you're from, and I'm not sure where your ministry unit's located, but thank you for asking this. Shari?
So I'm assuming just from that the services are your services that you're wanting to extend. For example, if you had a food bank and you wanted to make sure that they got food, that's what I'm reading out on there. But I would say generally, because of the history of colonization and the history and the role the church has played in it, there's a lot of fear. There's a lot of fear, and when they come, there's a lot of questions that we ask. And as Indigenous people, when you ask questions, it feels, even for me, if you're asking a lot of questions and I'm not ready for that learning mode, sometimes I'll feel like I'm just being bombarded with questions. And I remember somebody asking me a bunch of questions one time about Indigenous ministry, and we had just gone out for lunch, and they kept asking question after question. I said I felt like I was being shot at with a bunch of bullets. They were just coming at me, and I was like, this is uncomfortable. So when you ask a lot of questions, that can be what it feels like for Indigenous people, because culturally, we don't ask questions. When the elder gives you information, they'll tell you the information as you need to know it. They don't ask you a lot of questions. So it takes a great deal of emotional energy even to go through an interview process. And so that can be hard. But also having a non-Indigenous person on the other side of the desk sadly creates a barrier there. And you could be the most gentle, loving person, but just because you look different, you might have fairer skin, there's fear already in that, because of the history. We don't know if we ask a question, you might take our children. That's a huge fear. Whether it's real or not, you know, it's just one of those evident fears. So sometimes you need to be creative in that. Working alongside their group would be important. I know when we were in one ministry unit, we encountered this. And so we said, why don't we send out one of our workers to work alongside your workers, and we'll learn from you how you would do this, and we'll see what we can, you know, what services we can provide. And so a lot of the paperwork sometimes, Peter, plug your ears. A lot of the paperwork we actually had to do away with. And we just had to trust them as our leaders, that they, or as our partners in ministry, that they would make sure that the people that needed to get it got the services. So we would just go out, for example, at Christmas time with a load full of toys and say, this is for your community. You know, if you can just kind of tell us how many families, that would be great. But yeah, the Army kind of gives you a little bit of grief about the paperwork, but I push back just a bit and say, we have this. And so, yeah, we have to figure that out. The other part is, you know, in some ministry units, because that paperwork is important, we would say to them at the beginning, okay, we have this paperwork. This is our paperwork. Can you help us fill it out as best as you can, without having to, you know, grill people? And so sometimes the workers there or the leaders on band council would help. So does that kind of help that question?
Perfectly, thank you. It reminds me of my time up in Midland, where especially because the question came from Kitchener-Waterloo, and they said, yeah, it's about winter and food, winter wear program,
Okay.
Christmas and toys.
Yeah.
And for us, we always struggled with the folks coming from Christian Island over for our Christmas interview program, because they had to take a ferry and a bus or a taxi, and working with the local friendship center, it was suggested to us, why don't you go to the island? And
Yeah.
so for 2 years, we actually went over to the island and met them there. And so I just encourage you, just as Shari was saying, is create these friendships, create these opportunities where you get to meet the workers and the social workers and the supports within these communities, and create these friendships. It's as much as Shari says, it's not about the paperwork, it's about people. And in this, if I can use the word culture, we really have to identify with the norms of their culture, not ours. And that may mean less paperwork and not as much digging in, but more about relationship. And that's the message of the gospel. And so there's just one last comment, and then I'll just close off here. Kathy said she has to go. Shari, she said it's been very, very helpful. And you just encouraged her today. And so I just want to share that. Someone else has just asked for a copy of the slides. And yes,
Yeah.
Slides will be available with links to the websites that Shari said, as well as this has been recorded and you can come back to it. I won't give Shari's cell number right now, but you can get her at Shari_Russell@can.salvationarmy.org, and she would be very helpful. I know I was thinking of Wyerton and your work up there.
Yeah.
And they actually, in the family services, actually have a satellite office on the reserve.
And I would say that's largely in part due to the relationship building that has happened through the years.
Exactly. So, folks, I want to thank Shari, and I'm going to try to do it right. Metwich. While she was talking, I got onto Google and found a Indigenous language translating. And so, folks, there's a lot we can learn just off of Google and these websites. And as I said, Shari's available. this is, I think, a beginning of many things to come as we journey into reconciliation with our work in family services. Major Shari, thank you for doing this afternoon or this morning, depending where folks are tuning in. And if you have any further questions, myself and Major Shari are available, and she'd love to come see you, I know, especially at Belkin House in Vancouver. All right.
I would say make sure that you book me months in advance because my schedule in September is already full.
And when is the next powwow?
August 24th to 26th.
And where's it being held?
It's being held at Pine Lake, Alberta. It does count as a conference if you want to use it as a conference. And I would say that space will be limited this year.
So put that in your calendars. And if you can, get out to Alberta. The reports from the first powwow were very powerful. And I know that Shari's working hard on this one. So Lord bless you all. Have a great afternoon or morning, and we'll be back in touch. Thank you so much for tuning in. Take care.
Great. Bye.
Bye.